Hi everybody, today we're going to learn about the three things that affect photography. Hi everybody, I'm Curtis Eustace with CurtisEustacePhotography.com, a place where you can learn to be the photographer that you've always wanted to be. So, what are these three things that affect your photography? Well, they're actually pretty simple and they're very, very basic. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. These three things you'll have to pay attention to no matter what camera and lens combination you have. So let's dig right in. ISO. ISO is actually the sensitivity of the sensor and its ability to capture light. Back in the film day, back in 1986 when I started shooting sports photography, I had to shoot with high ISO films to be able to let more light in and raise my shutter speed to stop the action. So what does this all mean? So let's talk about the range of ISO. Back in the day, in the film day, we had Kodachrome film, which was a color transparency film that was 25 ISO. And they also had one that was 64 ISO. They may have had some other ones in between, but those were the two primary ones. These were considered to be slow films. So with a slow film, you had to have a lot of light coming through the lens and hitting the film to make an exposure. The same principle applies to digital cameras, but now we're talking about a sensor. Back in the film days, if the light was lower, the ambient light was lower, we needed a film that had a higher ISO, let's say 400, 800, 1600 ISO. So the light coming through could be less coming through the lens and hitting the film to make an exposure because the film was more sensitive to light. Now, same thing applies with digital cameras. The sensitivity of the sensor is adjustable now. So thank goodness for modern days. So if I'm shooting in 50 ISO and it's too dark for 50 ISO, I'm not getting an exposure because I can't get enough light coming through the lens. I either have to have an external light source or I can increase the ISO sensitivity of the sensor. So I'll take it up and I'll dial in 400, 800, 1600, whatever I need to get light to hit the sensor. Now, just as in the film days, a low ISO meant very little grain. A high ISO, or the high ISO as it climbed up, meant that the grain in the actual emulsion of the film got bigger because it needed to be more sensitive to the light. The basic principle of grain or noise and no noise applies to digital cameras. So if I'm shooting at a 50 ISO, let's say on my Sony, I'm going to have no noise whatsoever. But let's say I get into a low light situation where I have to increase the ISO or increase the sensitivity to the sensor and I have to dial in 1600, 2500, whatever ISO I need to get the exposure. Basically, I'm telling the sensor that it needs to be more sensitive to light. When I'm telling it it needs to be more sensitive to light, the sensor is actually drawing more power from the battery. And when this happens, it causes and creates more noise. So, depending on the size of your sensor, the bigger the sensor, the bigger the pixels, the less energy it needs to draw to the sensor to create that light. The smaller the sensor, the smaller the pixels. Typically speaking, it needs more energy to make that sensor sensitive to light. So, typically speaking, in a full frame camera with a full size sensor, you're going to have less grain at a higher ISO than you will at a cropped sensor with the same amount of pixels. But the big basic thing I want you guys to remember is low ISO, low noise, high ISO, high noise. You can get to a point where the ISO is so high and the noise is so great that the image can become unusable. So just keep that in mind. The second factor we need to think in consideration of has to do with our lenses and apertures. So The aperture range, you'll notice, is basically measured in f-stops. Typically speaking, depending on the lens, if it's just a consumer, not a professional lens, you're going to have f4, f3.5, maybe even f5.6, all the way up to f22 or f18. Usually it's f22. Okay, so f22 is letting in very, very little light. It's going to be a little itty bitty pinhole in the camera. At f4, it's going to be opening up to create a bigger opening to let more light through. So in a low light situation, the more that lens can open up, the more light it can let through to hit the sensor. In a very, very bright day, it's going to stop it down, okay, to let less light through to the sensor. All these things kind of play together and can get kind of complex, but that's basically the principle of it. One of the things that f-stop also has, or it creates, is depth of field. So when you have, let's say, opening of f4 and that lens opening is wide, your depth of field, the amount that's in focus in front of the subject and the amount of focus of the subject behind the subject, is going to be less. So in other words, this is my subject, here's the front, here's the back. As I start to go behind the subject, it's going to go out of focus, and as I come in front, it's going to be out of focus. This is what is called bokeh. So the bokeh creates this beautiful out of background effect where everything behind it is out of focus. Okay. Your f-stop isn't the only determining factor on depth of field. It's also magnification. A lot of people forget to talk about magnification, but if I'm in a zoom lens and I'm zoomed all the way in and I'm as close to the subject as I possibly can be and focused on that subject, my depth of field is going to be incredibly shallow. Okay, so keep that in mind. If I'm shooting a wide angle lens and basically I'm shooting at infinity and everything's going to be in focus, I can still be at the lowest f-stop and still have a great amount that's in focus. So magnification also has to deal with it, but that's just sort of an aside. Just remember, the lower the f-stop, let's say the lower the number, the bigger the opening. The larger the number, the smaller the opening. Okay? So now, the third and final thing is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration of which the shutter opens and closes. A slow shutter speed will be open-close. So if you have a subject that is moving, like a car, a person running, someone throwing a ball, whatever is going to be moving during that shutter is going to have some motion blur to it. So if you want to freeze motion, you'll have to increase your shutter speed to a much faster shutter speed. Let's say a 500th of a second, a thousandth of a second. A lot of these cameras will go up to 1/8,000th of a second. Okay, so that being the fastest. So all these three things play together. If I'm shooting in low light and all I can get is a 1/10 of a second, that might be too slow for a handheld camera without stabilization, sensor stabilization or lens stabilization. Just keep it in mind. So sometimes if you have a camera and you're doing a point and shoot and you're at a birthday party and you're shooting photos and it's dark and all your photos come back blurry, it's because the shutter speed was probably too slow. So this is when ISO, lens aperture, and shutter speed all come into play. So if I need to increase my shutter speed, but my lens is already wide open, I'll have to increase my ISO to get the shutter speed to come up. If my lens isn't all the way open and I'm still at the specific ISO, then I can open up the lens down to like a f2.8 or f.35, whatever it is, to increase the amount of light coming in through to enable me to get the shot. So the three play together. And so typically when we have a camera on auto, the camera will take care of it. But to be creative And to learn to make really cool photos, you need to learn to be able to play with your f-stop, apertures, and your ISO. And so this is getting out of the automatic mode and getting into your manual mode and playing with these three things. And it's a lot of fun, and you can do a lot of cool things with it. But you just have to remember the relationships between your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And it gets complex, and I've probably maybe even confused you a little bit, but the best way to learn this is just to play with it. So if you all have any questions about any of those three things, if you want me to go into more depth about any of those three things, just let me know in the comments below. If you're not subscribed to my channel, I'd appreciate a subscription. And as always, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.